Thank you and good morning. Good morning. Well, and thank you for that chorus of response. I hope you are prepared for more creative thinking today. Yes, I will be moving us to the environmental level, what supports innovation. But in order to do that, we have to understand what makes innovation possible. There are 7 key ingredients in innovation, in leading innovation successfully. And I'll talk through each of those in turn. And remember that our definition of innovation is not invention. It's not simply the raw idea. It's the ability to bring it into use. And that is in part a technical process, but it's heavily a human process. And it has to do with where ideas come from, how ideas surface, where creativity comes from, and how the process gets led to successful outcomes where in fact there is a new idea in use that can be diffused and be used as the basis for growth. So the first key ingredient is whether or not it's possible to surface new ideas by what I call tuning into the environment, seeing the context, understanding problems and opportunities. Innovation is triggered by seeing new possibilities, new ideas, new opportunities. And who gets to see them? I mean, opportunities are all around us. Problems exist everywhere. The inquiring mind, curiosity, where does it actually come from? It comes in part from opportunities to move outside of one's sector, outside of one's domain, outside of the standard. It often comes from wandering. It's why those who travel often bring back new ideas, because they're seeing the same thing from a different angle. The more we give people opportunities to learn outside of what they're comfortable with, outside of the domain in which they operate, then we have opportunities to see and sense the problems as well as potential solutions. And if there's no opportunity to do that, it's very difficult to innovate. In fact, everyone often is aware of the problems, don't really talk about it, but it is that ability to wander. It is the ability to travel outside of what's been comfortable and see the world from a different perspective that often triggers innovation. You understand there are 2 main theories about where innovation comes from and how one creates the environment for innovation. So that theory has to do with urbanization, with the crossroads of cultures, with encounters that are going to jar people into new ways of thinking because they have to put together ideas from very different sources. That theory is in contrast to the theories about clusters, that you get more innovation when you have clusters of related industries all working together to share ideas. One of my favorite historical examples of how innovation can be triggered by a certain amount of clash of experiences was another innovation way back in the past. And this was the invention of something that I think is very important to many families and households today. It's frozen foods. Well, frozen foods was actually an innovation that came from Clarence Birdseye, who for a long time had his name on a brand of vegetables called Birdseye. But it was Clarence Birdseye who founded the whole industry. Birdseye had a small produce business, a small vegetable shop in New York State. But he was an adventurer. And he loved to go on all kinds of adventure trips, and so at one point he was fur trapping in Labrador. And that was, of course, a very unfamiliar climate, and at one point he noticed that the fish caught in the ice seemed to be preserved because the natives ate it later. And he took that idea that came because he was on vacation and looking around, and he brought it back to his small produce shop in New York State, and suddenly had a way that he could preserve the vegetables and send them many places. I mean, it took experimentation, it took science to go from the idea to a flourishing business, but he invented an industry essentially, and I, for one, am very grateful when it's possible to go home at night and just defrost and not have to do it all from scratch. So it's that clash of experiences. I sometimes say that instead of just field trips, you know, we want to take students on field trips to go out and see something in the field, that I tell executives they should take people on far afield trips. Go far afield. Go well outside similar industries. See different things in different parts of the world and have to bring them together. So that ability to have those experiences, plus being in places that naturally bring together many people who are different and therefore challenge thinking, is part of the origins of ideas. You see opportunities, you also need to see problems, and the seeing of problems takes a particular kind of cultural characteristic, because it's entrepreneurs who lead innovation, not just entrepreneurs who start businesses. Anybody is entrepreneurial when they bring something new into being, and entrepreneurs have a particular characteristic that is interesting. They are restless and they are dissatisfied, and yet they fully believe there's something they can do about it. Innovation doesn't come, by the way, from total misery. It's not the places that are the worst off that create the most innovation. If you think about it, it's the places that are doing pretty well and are hungry for more. And so their dissatisfaction is that it's not as good as it could be, even though it might be pretty good. And you know, when I look at how performance is measured, say in companies and in other organizations, there are 3 ways you can measure performance. One way, I call them the 3 Ps. You can measure performance first against the past. Are we doing better than last year? And you can look at that and say, hey, yeah, we're a little better than last year. Isn't that wonderful? And if you do that, you may never change anything. You may not seek innovation because you say, look, things are on a little trajectory. You might say, well, looking at the past, it's not quite as good as last year, so we have to cut a little in order to make sure that we can get back up to where we were. So that's the first P. The second P is against peers. You know, benchmarking is very popular. Let's look at how somebody else is doing. Another company, another country, another county, how are they doing? And benchmarking supposedly triggers creativity, but it actually triggers imitation, not innovation. It triggers copying. Let's figure out what their best practice is, and then let's do the same thing. Well, if you measure against peers, first of all, you may never get better than the state of the art, right? Because if you're just imitating what they do, then you're not really adding anything new. But also, when you measure yourself against peers, you can also feel smugly satisfied. Hey, we're a little better than they are. Well, I think the real P of performance measurement, which is implicit, it's often hard to quantify, it's measuring yourself against potential. How good could we be? And that's what the entrepreneurial spirit is all about. It's about restlessness, it's about dissatisfaction, not because things are absolutely terrible. If they're absolutely terrible, you have to spend too much time fixing what's terrible. So we need the wandering, the restlessness, the wandering restlessness. We need dissatisfaction not because we're all miserable, because if all we do is sit around and whine and complain, there's never any change or any innovation. It's the dissatisfaction because we have a vision of what's possible, coupled with people who have a can-do spirit, who believe that there's something they could add that would make a difference. And sometimes those ideas exist everywhere and we never ask. There was a company that I worked with. It was a textile manufacturing company that made upholstery fabric for furniture. And, you know, that was an industry that was threatened by competition, international competition, and was working hard to be more efficient. They had great design. And on the dissatisfaction part, it certainly existed, but they didn't find the can-do people until there was a new plant manager who decided to walk around and ask everybody, what do you think? And he came upon a man who had worked in the factory for over 30 years, who had been an immigrant to the United States. This is an American story. He had been an immigrant. He spoke with an accent that was different from the other people in the factory, and so he was often hesitant to speak up. But he finally said to the factory manager, they had a big problem with yarn breakage. And they just built the yarn breakage into the cost of doing business. And they had that problem as long as anybody knew because of the kinds of fabric they were making. And when the new factory manager came along and talked to this worker about the problems, and the worker said, well, I have an idea. Well, I think I have an idea. He was very tentative, and his accent was still very difficult to understand. And so they tried his idea, and it worked. And so the factory manager went to him and said, how long had you had this idea? And he said, 32 years. Well, that actually happened, and we hope that ideas don't sit there for 32 years. We hope that we get them out faster. But it requires a culture in which people feel that they can speak up and there's something that they can do and that their ideas are valuable. And one can create that culture in countries as well as in organizations. You can create that culture by trying to surface ideas all the time, as well as by having people work in diverse teams that have to listen to different points of view, and they become more creative because of that. It's possible to do it. So that's the first factor, the ability to tune into the context, tune into the environment, sense problems and opportunities, and that gets you moving. The second factor is being able to find creative new approaches, creativity. A little different from just seeing the problem, seeing an opportunity. I call this kaleidoscope thinking. How to find new approaches. Kaleidoscope thinking. I think that the brain works a little bit like a kaleidoscope. And much of the new brain science is beginning to make this metaphor become clear. A kaleidoscope is just a simple device for seeing patterns. You look through a kaleidoscope, and a set of fragments form a pattern. But all you have to do is shake it, change angle, change direction, and exactly the same fragments form an entirely different pattern. The same elements, different pattern, different possibilities. That's what creativity often is. It's often not inventing something totally new. It's often putting things together in a very different way. If you want a culture that supports creativity, which is an ingredient in innovation, it needs to be a culture of play. And whenever there's a high level of genius. I mean, it's interesting that engineers, I don't know what many of you may be engineers. I don't know whether you have an image of engineers or not, but I know that many people in my country would not consider engineers to be, say, the most playful people in the world. I mean, they think of them as kind of serious, technical people. But in fact, engineers are often incredibly playful because what they do is they play with ideas. They're doing design. At Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, the neighbor down the road from us at Harvard, MIT has some of the best pranks in the world. The undergraduates at MIT, until they started getting reined in because of, safety concerns or other things, used to have incredible playful pranks where they would take their science and engineering and do something really incredibly fun and funny and often, very irreverent. So finding an environment where people can play with ideas and where it's okay to be a little irreverent about tradition, you get the kaleidoscope going. And that's the second ingredient in supporting innovation. The third is the old thing we keep coming back to around leadership, vision. Leadership is incredibly important to innovation. It's not just ideas that pop up. Nothing will happen to the idea. I talked about entrepreneurs and the entrepreneurial spirit already. An entrepreneur is somebody who leads the finding of resources to make an idea become real in practice. Well, you need leadership. You need people who are willing to articulate a vision, stand behind it, and encourage other people to follow them, or you don't necessarily get innovation. You can get some invention by lone geniuses who work by themselves in a basement or in a tower, but actually that's even rarer. Even the process of invention is increasingly a collaborative process. But when it comes to innovation, which is going from the idea into its use, that third ingredient, leadership, is absolutely critical. And leadership courage is required. And in some cultures, there may be potential leaders, but not a lot of courage. Because what innovation requires is somebody who stands up and says, this is important. This is going to take us someplace different, and I have a vision of what that new possibility is. Because otherwise the idea would languish. Nobody would do anything with it. You need people with the courage to speak up for ideas. So as part of developing the capacity for innovation, we've got to develop leaders. We've got to develop them starting at a young age, not just scientists. Absolutely, we need scientists, we need engineers, we need people who know fields in depth, but we also need leaders who are willing to see the vision, see the use, and can advocate for it, communicate about it, inspire other people. They can have the dream, talk the dream, and rally other people behind them. And that's important because of the fourth ingredient, which is you need a coalition to get an innovation. You need backers and supporters. You need collaboration. And of course, we know you often need capital, but the capital comes from the backers and supporters. And they not only provide capital, they provide cover, political cover, they provide advocacy, they provide information, they provide access to other resources. Innovations are a collective product often. Just as we know we need capital, so every country that wants more innovation says we need more venture capital, we need more angel investors. Well, you also need leaders who know how to get those people, convince those people, get those people on board and sell the ideas to them. You need buy-in from just the key backers and supporters needed to get the idea into use. Well, the fifth ingredient is the team. You need a working team. You need people with skills. You need people who can support the development of the innovation from idea to realization. And for that, you need skills. You need a skilled workforce. Inside a company, every entrepreneur inside a company, every entrepreneur outside a company has to build a working team. Nobody advances innovation by themselves. They create an organization to do it, whether that organization is a team inside a company or the organization is a new business. And they need the skills and they need the ability to build a team that takes ownership of the idea. So that requires both workforce skills that are as advanced as the idea, and you don't get innovations off the ground in play. That's where the industry cluster also comes into play. It's hard to get ideas off the ground in a place where there are no people with some of the skills that are needed to do that. I mean, Germany, well, I spoke for let me say about Germany, I spoke for the German Marketing Association a couple of years ago, and once I got over whether that was an oxymoron, German marketing, we had a great time. But in fact, there's a country that has incredible technical skills, incredible manufacturing skills, but hadn't really thought much about marketing skills for a long time, and so wasn't necessarily able to capitalize on all of the technical skills. Now it's, of course, an incredibly growing economy. And every innovator, every leader of innovation needs the working team. The team has to have ownership, feel ownership. I don't mean they have to actually have equity, but there needs to be some way for the team to feel it's theirs, they feel rewarded for it. And because of the sixth important ingredient in innovation, which is to master the difficult middles of change, to persist and persevere. So, we like the endings, we like the beginnings. We like the beginnings because it's all exciting to envision the future. We like the ending when you've got your product on the market and the money is flowing in. It's just the middle that's hard work. It's everything else. So it's Kanter's law. Everything can look like a failure in the middle. And there are predictable reasons that middles are difficult when you're engaged in innovation and change. One is the forecasting problem. It's very difficult to predict how long it will take or how much it will cost if you've never done it before. And so actually, many people get support for their ideas by doing something we call in my jargon lowballing, a lowball estimate of what it's going to cost and how long it's going to take, knowing that when it doesn't come in on time and on budget, you have to go back and argue for more. That's a shame. We ought to be able to understand the real time horizons and the real costs. But again, that's in the culture and whether or not it supports innovation. If it's a conservative culture that says we've got to do everything on the cheap, then you're going to discourage people from being honest and realistic about what it takes. Second reason middles are so difficult is because you run into unexpected obstacles. If you're doing something new and different, you're down a path that hasn't been taken before, and there may be some obstacle that no one knew was there because you hadn't gone down that road before. So innovation requires flexibility. It requires supportive funders and supportive backers who understand it's going to be it may turn out that it's a slightly different path. In fact, it may turn out to be a slightly different product than what we thought it was going to be in the first place. Third reason middles are difficult is the team gets tired. It is hard work. It's very hard work. And so the culture has to support it. The culture has to value and honor the hard work people are doing. We have a lot of now new contests and awards and stuff in Massachusetts to help value and support the innovators. And finally, the fourth reason middles are difficult is that's when the critics surface. Not in the beginning. In the beginning, a new idea is just rhetoric. It's just an interesting thing in the press. It's only when it looks like it might actually happen that it gets threatening. That's when the industry leaders say, now wait a second, they're going to disrupt my model. We shouldn't allow this. And they start wanting to regulate it or kill it. That's when the critics surface. So persistence and perseverance. This is where I go back to leaders with a vision. If you don't have leaders with a vision, a passion for it, willing to persist, you can't turn over the manager every few years. If you don't have backers and supporters who are willing to fight for it and argue for it because they're invested in it, and if you don't have a team that really cares, the whole thing will fall apart. And the difference between success and failure is often how long you give it before you give up. And if you have a culture of premature giving up, one in which there haven't been enough partnerships, there haven't been enough support, it's very difficult to get more innovation. That's why I think all the collaborative programs of Intertrade Ireland are so important. And finally, the last ingredient, which I'll be very short about, is that you need to celebrate success and make everyone a hero. That's if you want any more of it. You have to make heroes out of those that are working on it, not just the individual, the whole team, because that's what gives people the spirit to try again. Because innovation is fraught with failure. It's not always predictably going to work. It's a portfolio. Like the venture capitalists talk about, you might have, out of every 10 investments, you might have 2 really big hits, if you're lucky. You might have 2 abject failures, and you might have, 6 mediocre things in the middle, maybe with a little promise. So you have to celebrate success, and so you need a culture where the people who work on new and difficult things get honored, get recognized. And again, prizes, publicity are all part of the mix of places that support innovation. Thank you very much.